My parents spent years dismissing my little side hustle as a flighty hobby that would eventually die out, right until I hit the seven-figure mark and left their golden child, my cousin Chloe, speechless at her own graduation brunch. My name is Maya. I am 31 years old, and if the scorching Arizona sun has taught me anything, it's that heat eventually forces everything to the surface. I never followed the well-trodden path my relatives carved out for themselves. While my cousins were busy packing their bags for prestigious law schools in the Northeast or securing internships at high-stakes medical firms just to pad their LinkedIn profiles and earn parental bragging rights, I was holed up in my home office in Scottsdale, building an e-commerce empire out of nothing but grit and late-night caffeine. Began as a niche venture, selling custom-designed Southwestern home decor, then shifted into sustainable artisan furniture. And suddenly, the business snowballed into a major operation. While my family was busy submitting resumes and waiting for corporate approval, I was meticulously managing an LLC, filing complex tax returns, and overseeing a supply chain that moved thousands of units. Yet, in the eyes of my mother, I remained perpetually between jobs. Whenever we attended weddings or desert gatherings, I was introduced as the girl who was still finding her direction. It was as if my success didn't exist unless a man in a suit stood next to me to validate it. The breaking point arrived at the graduation celebration for my cousin, Chloe. She was 23, the quintessential golden girl of our family circle, having just graduated from a top-tier university with a degree in political science. She was the one who volunteered at high-profile charities, spoke 3 languages, and maintained a social media presence that looked like a curated magazine shoot. I never harbored any deep-seated resentment toward her personally. We were civil, distant, and largely indifferent to one another. But Chloe possessed an insufferable need for external validation, constantly waiting for the room to applaud at the end of every sentence. Her parents, my aunt and uncle, were the primary fuel for this fire. Every minor milestone was turned into a gala, complete with framed certificates, group text notifications, and a dedicated photo album on social media. When the invitation to her brunch arrived, a high-end affair hosted in a gated community in Paradise Valley, featuring a massive tent, string lights, and an open bar, I knew exactly what role I had been cast in. I arrived early to bypass the chaos, only to be greeted by Aunt Susan, who was waving a parking vest at me as if I were a hired hand. She didn't offer a hello or a thank you for coming. She simply shoved the vest into my chest, mentioning how overwhelmed they were and how my skills in logistics and that little internet shop would be perfect for managing the influx of luxury SUVs. I stood there, stunned, holding that neon polyester as if I were a college freshman working a side job. I should have walked away then. I should have tossed the vest on the hood of my car and driven back to the cool silence of my own home. Instead, a misguided sense of familial obligation took over. I spent the next 90 minutes in the blistering Arizona heat, sweating through my clothes, directing traffic into the sprawling grass of the estate, and helping elderly relatives navigate the uneven desert terrain. No one relieved me. No one offered me water. By the time I finally trudged toward the buffet line, the celebration was in full swing, and my name was relegated to a tiny, obscure place card hidden behind a large cactus centerpiece. I watched from the sidelines as Chloe moved through the crowd, radiating a confidence that felt less like joy and more like a practiced performance. When the microphone was eventually passed to her, she tapped it with a dramatic flair that drew every eye in the tent. She thanked everyone for their presence, specifically emphasizing how much it meant to be surrounded by people who valued real education and tangible career paths, especially in an era where people were so easily distracted by insignificant online hobbies. Her gaze locked onto mine with surgical precision. The pause she took was heavy, intentional, and biting. The reaction from the guests was immediate. A wave of laughter rippled through the tent, led by her father, who snorted into his drink. Even my mother offered a tight, uncomfortable smile, seemingly embarrassed yet unable to resist the social pressure to join in. I felt a hot, prickling sensation rise up my neck, but I kept my composure, staring down at the condensation on my glass. It wasn't just about the slight against my work. It was the cumulative weight of years of silent dismissals, the way my updates were always skipped over to discuss the prestigious backgrounds of Chloe's professors, and the way I was consistently cropped out of the family narrative. As the music began and the guests drifted toward the dance floor, I stood up, smoothed out my clothes, and walked directly into the center of their spotlight. I approached the main table where Chloe was surrounded by her inner circle, still basking in the glow of the applause. I kept my tone casual, loud enough for those nearby to hear. I congratulated her, noting how wonderful it was that her degree had led her to such a supportive environment. Then, I took a long, steady sip of my drink. I made it clear that while she was celebrating her graduation, my little internet hobby had brought in over $1.2 million in revenue that fiscal year alone. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a storm. Chloe's smile fractured, her expression turning from smug superiority to sheer shock. Someone at the table dropped their fork, the metallic clatter sounding like a gunshot in the still air. My uncle stood frozen, and my mother blinked at me, her mouth slightly agape as if she couldn't translate the numbers I had just dropped into her reality. I didn't wait to see how they would recover. I simply nodded, turned around, and began my walk toward the estate gate. I didn't turn back, even as I felt the weight of 100 stares burning into my back. I knew that moment would reverberate through the family like a shockwave. I hadn't planned on saying a word, but years of being the family's invisible benefactor, the one they used for favors while mocking my existence, had finally reached a boiling point. When I climbed into my car, the silence was a relief. I didn't need their reaction. I had already delivered the message. As I drove away from the heat of the valley, my phone began to vibrate incessantly. First, it was my mother, scolding me for embarrassing the family and demanding I undo the damage. Then came my aunt, demanding to know if what I said was really necessary. I ignored every single notification. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and focused on the road ahead. By the time I pulled into the driveway of my own quiet, modern home, I felt the first true sense of peace I had experienced in years. That night, I slept soundly, knowing the illusion of the struggling dropout had been permanently shattered. The following days unfolded in a series of shockwaves. I returned to my business emails on Monday morning to find 3 unexpected interview requests from industry publications. It turned out that one of Chloe's acquaintances had looked up my company immediately after the brunch and was genuinely impressed by the scale of what I had built. They used words like innovative and formidable, terms that felt vastly different from the labels my family had applied to me. A month earlier, I would have deflected these opportunities, but this time, I took the calls myself. I was finally ready to define my own narrative. By Tuesday evening, my mother showed up at my front door without warning. She arrived clutching a container of food, attempting to recreate the familiar dynamic of a struggling daughter needing support. I let her in, watching as she paced my living room, her eyes darting over the high-end minimalist furniture and the art pieces I had curated. The space was a reflection of a life she had never taken the time to understand. When she finally spoke, her voice was strained. She told me I had devastated Chloe and shamed the entire family. I leaned against my kitchen island, arms folded, and told her plainly that I hadn't started this conflict, I had simply brought it to a conclusion. When I confirmed the 7-figure success of my company, she reacted as if I had confessed to something illicit, a dark secret that threatened the family's reputation. I laughed, though there was no malice in it. I explained that I had shared my progress for years, but she had always filtered out any information that didn't fit the narrative of me being the lost cousin. She wanted a version of me that was inferior, someone she could pity to bolster her own sense of status. As she sat down, visibly shaken, she had no rebuttal. She pivoted to discussing Chloe's struggles to find employment, clearly hoping to elicit sympathy. I didn't take the bait. I simply stood my ground, making it clear that I was finished with the role of the family scapegoat and the secret bank account for their mistakes. The true escalation occurred that weekend when my Aunt Susan left a frantic voicemail. She didn't lead with an apology or a conversation. She went straight to a financial crisis. My uncle's hours had been reduced, the lease on Chloe's luxury vehicle was becoming impossible to manage, and she was reaching out to me as if I were still the person who would jump at the chance to perform a service. Hearing her request for a handout was the final click in the mechanism of my patience. I sat at my kitchen table and pulled up a detailed spreadsheet I had maintained for years. It wasn't a record of bitterness. but one of reality, a ledger of every loan, every gift, and every bill I had covered for them, from the textbooks for my cousins to the emergency home repairs for my aunt. The total was staggering, far exceeding $40,000, not counting interest or the years of emotional labor I had poured into a family that never reciprocated. I looked at the numbers and felt a profound, cold clarity. I didn't need to be cruel, I just needed to be finished. I sent a message to Chloe and a similar note to my aunt and uncle, articulating that while I acknowledged her hard work, I would no longer be a silent participant in my own devaluation. When my mother called to beg me to reconsider, I cut the conversation short. I didn't need their permission to stop being a prop in their play. The finality of my decision seemed to leave my family in a state of stunned paralysis. For 3 days, the silence was absolute. I assumed they were waiting for me to break, to offer a compromise, or to reach out with a peace offering, but I stayed quiet, finally enjoying the stillness of my home. It was the 3rd day when I received the calendar invitation from Chloe. It was simple, cold, and unexpected. A request for coffee at a downtown cafe. I debated declining, but curiosity won out. I wanted to see if there was a person underneath the polish, or if the golden girl was merely a costume she didn't know how to take off. We met on a gray, overcast Saturday. Chloe arrived late, her attire impeccable as always, but her expression lacked its usual sharp, performative edge. We sat for a long moment, the silence between us heavy with years of unspoken competition. She eventually admitted that she had read my message repeatedly. She confessed that her mockery at the brunch was never truly about my career. It was a projection of her own paralyzing anxiety. With a degree that hadn't secured her a position and a luxury lifestyle her parents couldn't actually sustain, she had lashed out to feel superior for one fleeting moment. She then did something I never anticipated. She pulled out her phone, opened her social media, and recorded a public apology. It wasn't rehearsed or glib. She spoke directly to her followers, owning her pettiness and explicitly validating the success of my business. When she posted it, the shift in the room was palpable. She didn't ask for a loan, and she didn't try to manipulate the situation. She simply chose to strip away the mask. In that moment, the years of feeling like the family's afterthought began to dissolve. A month later, at a family barbecue, the atmosphere was fundamentally changed. I didn't arrive early to set up, and I wasn't handed a task to perform. I was treated as a guest. When a distant relative asked about my work, it was Chloe who spoke up, describing the scope of my brand with genuine admiration. The resulting silence from the rest of the family wasn't judgmental anymore. It was respectful. The luxury vehicle had been returned, and Chloe had moved on to a role that actually mattered to her, rather than one chosen to impress her parents. My mother never fully understood the technicalities of my business, but she had stopped treating me as an unfinished project. I still keep that spreadsheet, not to hold their past mistakes over them, but as a map of the territory I had to cross to reach this point of independence. I learned that you don't need to chase validation when you finally realize you never required it in the first place. Prosperity was fine, but the clarity that came from setting a boundary was the real prize. The noise of their expectations had faded into the background, and for the first time, I was finally content with the sound of my own life.